Russia's progress in Ukraine has stalled, and the chaos on the front lines is slowly creeping onto the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg. What's a Putin to do in this kind of situation? Well, that seems like a great topic for today's edition of the Geopolitics Helpline. Putin said that he was going to escalate the war against Ukraine. Does he even have any escalation options left? Nope. Like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Okay, fine. I will give you a real answer. But you can understand why the dismissive answer is the right one. For background, here is the key quote from Putin from the military meeting that you are watching now. The more strikes the enemy attempts against our civilian infrastructure, and, of course, our foremost priority is to do everything necessary to protect these facilities and the civilian population. The more such attempts they make, the larger the security zone we will be compelled to establish in the adjacent territory, especially since this area, like the other territories we have discussed today, is historically Russian land. Great, but talk is cheap, and Russia needs real answers. None of what we explore today qualifies as such. Rather, I am presupposing that the Kremlin insists on escalating, and then figuring out how best to go from there. After all, if your project is failing, you may wish to pursue some bad ideas to try to turn things around. Also, I will not go down the road of Russia is expanding Program X and will use those weapons to strike Ukraine. That is not escalation. That is Russia trying to win the war aside from whatever Ukraine is up to, and making the appropriate investments in that light. Also, I am not even sure how far Russia will get with those options at this point. The most common line of thought here is drone production. Russia is indeed constantly expanding its factory infrastructure, which is why Ukraine keeps seeing new record drone attacks. Nonetheless, there is no saying that this trend will continue. Russian air defenses are shot, and Ukraine's own long-range drones and missiles now pack enough punch to meaningfully damage buildings. So the Kremlin must now worry about Ukraine striking the factories and the storage facilities for unlaunched drones. There are no guarantees here, but it is something to add to the list of the Kremlin's concerns. With that, let me now cover a variety of nuclear-related options. The first of these is to fire a nuclear-capable missile on Ukraine. The difference, though, between nuclear-capable and nuclear-equipped is gigantic. When a nuclear-capable but not nuclear-equipped missile strikes a target, we as observers might as well just describe it as a missile striking a target. This may all sound familiar because Russia has done this multiple times with the Oreshnik missile. Each time, the Kremlin gets on television to warn Ukraine and the West about what might happen next. What you are watching is in fact the first of these messages. While they indeed sound very threatening, at the end of the day, Russia just used a missile to attack Ukraine, and then made threats afterward that are subject to our standard criticism. I would not be surprised if Russia tried this again. However, the problem with the framing of our current conversation is that this isn't really an escalation at all. It is an attempt to do something that looks like an escalation to the untrained eye, but is just another day of war for those who are in the know. A second nuclear option, and one that is more serious, is to test a nuclear weapon. Technically, Russia has never tested a nuclear weapon. All of the old Soviet tests ended in 1990, and Russia never followed afterward. Russia is a signatory of the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which, among other things, forbids nuclear tests above ground. This was instituted because it turns out that frequent nuclear tests above ground irradiate the atmosphere. Once upon a time, Russia had also signed and ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which, as the name seems to imply, comprehensively bans nuclear tests, including those done underground. This theory goes, Russia conducts a test, and the violation of the international norms, plus the cost of actually producing the nuclear weapon, is a credible signal of Russian sincerity of the threat to escalate to something more tangible. Nonetheless, there are multiple problems here. For one, you may have noticed that I said that Russia had previously signed and ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, but Russia pulled out of the ratification portion of that in 2023. Maybe you remember that happening, but I suspect that the majority of us have since forgotten because it was not a particularly meaningful measure. Actually, testing is a step further. It does not meet what we in the industry would refer to as an incentive compatibility requirement. A test of a nuke would indeed upset a lot of individuals. But if the aim here is to force Ukraine and the West to back down, the measure is not so costly so as to deter less committed types of Russia from taking the action. In other words, if we treated the nuclear test as proof positive of the sincerity of Russia's threats, and then responded accordingly, an uncommitted type of Russia would want to bluff under those conditions. And then you run into the deeper problems with what a committed type would face after actually using the nuclear weapon. A threat is only as good as the receiver's belief that you would follow through. Let's examine that further in the lens of a third nuclear strategy: to use a tactical nuclear weapon. The irony here is strong. If you looked at a continuum of weapon sophistication, you might put drones on one end and nuclear weapons on the other, yet they wind up encouraging similar counterplay. Drones have forced both sides to spread out on the battlefield. We do not have large columns of troops lined up, either to push in a single direction of attack or along a trench. Rather, it is a soldier here, a soldier there, a soldier in a third place, and so forth. Well, this pretty much describes the worst possible circumstances to use a tactical nuclear weapon. The Kremlin, again, would get on television and claim that they are serious, pointing to the use of the tactical nuclear weapon as evidence for that. However, it would be unclear if Russia was better off doing that versus simply sending a handful of drones into that zone instead. I do not think that you need me to tell you that there is a substantial cost difference between the two. Finally, on the nuclear front, we could just go straight to a strategic nuclear weapon detonated over a Ukrainian city. Unlike the rest of this conversation, this is actually serious. No one would question the resolve of Russia afterward. It would also be one of the darkest days in humanity's history. But the problem here is the same problem that has prevented Russia from using nuclear weapons for the last 4 years. This would absolutely infuriate China and India. Both would cut trade ties. And none of that would advance what is happening on the battlefield itself. War need not produce a winner and a loser. It is a negative-sum game. And thus, nuclear use here might only guarantee that both sides lose more. Switching gears, another option is to engage in a second round of mobilization. This follows the first round conducted in the fall of 2022 in response to the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and as seen being announced here. Of all of the options for today, I believe that this one is the most plausible. However, it would still be incredibly risky, and there is no guarantee that it will bring sufficient returns to justify that risk. Half of the problem is well understood. The Kremlin quickly shifted to a voluntary contracts model after Russian citizens started to resist the mobilization measures 4 years ago. Putin has not touched it since then, precisely because he is concerned about the political ramifications. I do not believe that mobilization for a second time would inherently bring down the current government. The question for the Kremlin, though, is what sort of returns will it bring on the battlefield versus how much extra risk will it add to Moscow's plate? For example, is a 5 to 10 percentage point increase in the likelihood of protests on the street worth securing all of the Donbass? That is a question for Putin, because it weighs how much he cares about maintaining control of Russia versus how much he values taking over portions of Ukraine. What we can say, at least for now, is that the risk is not worth the current reward, but that is subject to change if the battlefield prospects turn worse. The second half of the problem is overlooked by comparison. I am not even sure that this is the economically sensible thing to do. Usually, the conversation about mobilization begins by noting that Russia is struggling to fund its war effort. The problem with contract soldiers is that you have to pay them contract wages that are competitive with what less risky private sector jobs could bring in. Mobilization, however, forces citizens to the front lines. There may still be some basic military pay, but it will not be nearly as much. 2 points. 1. Soldier wages are only a fraction of the war expense. The Kremlin still must pay for all of the equipment and weapons that the soldiers bring to the battlefield. And 2, we will undoubtedly observe a repeat of the reaction from wealthier Russians that we saw back in 2022. Anyone who is subject to military service and has the means to leave Russia will have to strongly consider that option. When you have hundreds of thousands fleeing the country, you will have a significant economic disruption that comes with it, particularly because these wealthier individuals are often higher on the corporate ladder. Thus, their departure might eliminate jobs for individuals who have no plans to leave. I cannot confidently say that this is indeed a worse economic outcome than simply continuing the current contract system, but it might be. In turn, it must be a consideration when trying to choose between the two alternatives. You hear far less discussion about the Kremlin simply opening up its coffers to increase the ranks of the Russian armed forces, and yet that may be the more sensible option. Another option in the plausible category is to do more wonky things to Western countries. I do not just mean a hybrid attack or otherwise against Poland, as an intelligence report recently indicated was something that the Kremlin was planning. I am also referring to things like mysterious fires in warehouses in France or Germany. Russia has plausible deniability when they happen, and they already have happened, by virtue of the covert means. But you could see a pathway here where Russia escalates on this front with the roundabout hope that it induces more NATO governments to rethink aid allocations to Ukraine. Or, absent that, tying back to our discussion from a moment ago about mobilization, Europe overreacts in a manner that gives the Kremlin the ability to twist those actions domestically. Russian propaganda outlets then rally greater political support for the war. The main problem here, as I discussed over on the main channel when the Poland intelligence report came out, is that the causal mechanism of this strategy is ambiguous. You do something to Western governments, then something happens, and then you win in Ukraine. I am doubtful that the Kremlin has a better handle on what Phase 2 is than I do, which is why I liken this strategy to a spin of the wheel to see what happens. Thus, it is again plausible, but it is not something that is a guarantee, either in Russia doing it or it succeeding. The final escalation step is less about the escalation itself, and more about a means to send more men and materiel to Ukraine. It is to look for international help to fund everything. Obviously, Russia has had help from its counter-coalition before. You can think about Iran sending Shahed drones to Russia as the backbone of Russia's strategic bombing campaign. You could also look to North Korea and the troops that Kim Jong-un sent to defend internationally recognized Russia during the Kursk offensive. However, the real prize is support from Beijing. I do not just mean standard financial help through market rate trade, whether I'm referring to crude oil purchases or sales of quadcopter parts. I mean China doing Russia a favor by giving out loans for the purposes of increasing war spending. Beijing must be careful here, though. It is already suspicious of the utility of the Ukraine project overall, and there will be further caution because Beijing does not trust its unlimited partner to make good on its end of a deal when the time comes. We have seen this directly with negotiations over the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. It would benefit both parties to get that built, but they have not gotten past the early planning stages. Unlike before, Russia cannot simply take this measure. The Kremlin would need to convince others that it can credibly commit to the deals that it signs with foreign partners. But there is no magical solution for that. It is even a step worse because if China thinks that the war may cause Putin to fall, there is no guarantee that the next leader will recognize the terms of an agreement that Putin made with Xi. Consequently, something like the sale of rare earth deposit rights within central Russia cannot be agreed to despite substantial interest on China's end to expand its portfolio. Indeed, the only thing that may truly be credible from Beijing's perspective is to redraw the border with Russia and China in some areas where there has been historical disagreement. That type of thing would be hard for a new leader of Russia to wrest away, given that China will have already occupied the location. In turn, this becomes a question of just how desperate Putin is, whether his desire to leave a historical legacy of expanding borders into Europe beats out whatever historical shame would be brought by losing possession of a territory in the Far East. So there you have 7 escalation options for Russia, none of which are good, and some of which may nonetheless be pursued. Meanwhile, I have more than 7 episodes of the Geopolitics Helpline ready for you to watch. It is less than 70, but give me a few weeks and maybe we will get there together. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow. Take care.